Let's unravel Geeta's world. We all had our mischievous adventures as kids, didn't we? Personally, if you would ask me, I would fondly recall when anybody would ask me, to share any of the notorious habits as kid. I would fondly share about me, against my mother's wishes, eating soil out of sheer curiosity. But imagine if that's what we had to eat right now, just soil, nothing else. Would we actually fondly remember still? We would still have that pride and laughter while recalling that. Hello, this is Anna, and this is Geeta's World. With me is Geeta Mohan. And today we are discussing something really important that's happening in Sudan. It's a country in Africa. Sadly, most of us don't know about it because I was having this conversation with my father last night. And he said, okay, Sudan is in Africa, right? So that's the reality, Geeta. And to continue what I was saying, Sudan is a country we have discussed in our previous episode regarding the civil war that actually engulfed, I think for the past 1 year, that has engulfed the country. And there was a frontline reporter who said that, who wrote about a family. He said about a father actually, who said that in front of his eyes, he saw his wife and children digging holes in the ground and looking for soil and rolling them and putting it in their mouths and swallowing them as with water. So that's the situation because starvation has hit the country. So Geeta, tell me, we have discussed about it. So I mean, we can start by actually understanding that what really went wrong in the past 1 year. Of course, if we talk about the history, definitely it's really long back because Sudan and many, many, many countries in Africa, they are grappling with many military coups. But this in Sudan was different because it's about power control. It's about, the RSF and the Sudanese military army. And RSF is a paramilitary. It's a very powerful paramilitary force in Sudan. So what really happened? Because the aftermath is really, there are millions who have been displaced. There are millions who are starving. So,
well, it's a very sad situation because it comes at a time when the world is reeling under a lot of conflicts, crises, which they're grappling with. And therefore, one of the most important crises that faces the international community has gone on for way too long and without any checks. There are international organizations who have asked as to why is the international community so quiet on a situation such as this. And yes, Sudan right now is on the brink of famine, starvation. One of the UN agencies, UNHCR, actually said that they're living on leaves.
Oh my God.
So
they're eating grass.
They're eating grass and leaves because there's nothing to eat. And we have 4.5 million people displaced, 1 million within Sudan, 1 million outside of Sudan who left the country, have moved to Chad, Egypt, and the other neighboring countries, and the rest of them displaced within. But this is not starvation because of unknown factors, nature, weather conditions, climate change alone. This is a man-made famine. Yeah. And that's what we're coming to. It is a crisis that we saw begin, and we discussed this when two camps, after the ousting of the dictatorship in Sudan,
and we would think that
Omar al-Bashir, who was ousted in 2019,
and
everybody thought
peace would prevail.
That peace would return, that there would be normalcy. And instead of that, what we saw is the military regime that helped oust Omar al-Bashir split into two factions. One is the military command itself, and the other is the paramilitary force, the RSF. And since 2023, there has been the most difficult time for the country with the worst kind of civil war that and we can't compare it to Rwanda and the rest, but one of the worst civil wars that an African nation has dealt with. And
But
this
Geeta,
continues, the power struggle continues. This even as the unemployment rate is at its peak. There is no work. There are no jobs.
There's no electricity.
There is no food.
There's no food. There's no water.
It is actually, if you look at the videos and if you see the dispatches coming from Sudan, Anna, it is heartbreaking. We knew of how terrible things would get, when there were famines in various parts of Africa and how the international community was helping. But this time around, it is not that. It's a civil war.
Yeah.
So not only are you dying of hunger, you're also dying because you're being killed.
Yeah.
And if you're fleeing from a civil war, from a fight, only to end up dead because of hunger.
Yes.
And this is just the worst.
And like you're saying, it's just not, physical illness, of course, there. But what about the mental conflict, the mental trauma, right? Because, like, while I was reading the dispatches, they're talking about gruesome sexual violence. The children are being, so-called inducted into the military.
There is conscription, yes. Where kids are forcefully being made to fight.
Yes. But I think to better understand and for our listeners and viewers to also relate to this entire issue, I'm comparing these two to understand, and make them more relatable. I'm comparing the situation in Sudan with what is happening right now in Gaza. Correct me if I'm wrong, Geeta, but if we see Sudan's situation, of course, like we said, it's very grim, right? People are fleeing to a place called El Fasher, which is the only city in Darfur, a region in western Sudan, that has not been captured by the RSF, which is the paramilitary force. And yet it has not been captured and hosts thousands of people who have been displaced by the war. So there have been increasing arbitrary killings, systematic burning of entire villages, escalating air bombardments, people dying of hunger, diseases like malaria, cholera, women being sexually assaulted, and to top that, of course, deliveries of food assistance in Darfur, which we saw in Gaza, being obstructed by so-called, bureaucratic hurdles. If we talk about it, I think at least 1.7 million people within the region are experiencing emergency levels of hunger, according to the World Food Programme. Despite this deepening human crisis, the situation in Sudan has drawn, it's marginal, less international scrutiny than other humanitarian emergencies in places such as Ukraine and Gaza. Of course, Ukraine and Gaza also are really not comparable, but still, some observers have called Sudan's conflict the forgotten war. Why? Why the hell do we know so little about it? And why don't we even care to know about it?
See, a war is given a lot of focus if it impacts you, the region, the global economy, so on and so forth. Russia-Ukraine war certainly impacts the West, their stakeholders. Israel-Hamas war impacts not just the region, but it'll impact global economy should this escalate and should there be states getting involved in this war between Israel and Hamas. In this case, because it seems, while it is not, but it still seems a little more isolated, is one of the main reasons why we do not see the kind of action being brought into this scenario and into this crisis. That certainly is a reason. We're looking at a lot of aid that is going in, and UNHCR and other UN agencies, Amnesty, all of these human rights organizations, all of them going in and doing a lot of work and seeking international intervention. But I think the main reason is this. Also, in some parts of the world, whilst that might be the case in any part of the world, but the reasons are very easy for them to say, well, this is very important. Yeah. But over here, when you have two warring factions within a country, it becomes very difficult
to actually
go in. Okay. So the intervention becomes very difficult. Okay. It's very, very chaotic. There are no sides to be taken per se, but yes, the way and the manner in which
it's mostly the RSF who is
who are now
brutally
claiming and brutally trying to take over the country, and much to the dismay of the military, the army, and they have managed to quite an extent. Although all the charges that have been leveled against them, be it of assault, exploitation, loot, killing, they're denying all of that. But there's enough evidence, there are enough eyewitnesses, there are enough people who have fled from those areas and are speaking for RSF to really continue being in denial. So right now, I think it is just because there's too much focus on other parts, on other issues and other parts of the world, is the reason why this has gone on for too long. But when an entire population is rendered not just homeless, but hopeless in terms of a future or even a life, the international community cannot turn a blind eye.
Definitely, yeah. And if we talk about, I mean, like you were saying about the RSF, which is actually, being brutally involved in this. So while I was reading, there was an NPR reporter from Sudan only, and he explained this, that the northern Darfur region is in turmoil with Al-Fashir under siege. So this is surrounded by the RSF. But I read that the reason why the RSF are so intent on capturing this particular city is because if they are able to take Al-Fashir, that will be the entire region of Darfur, which has the size of France. So it is going to be under the control of the RSF, the Rapid Support Forces, which means that they will have access to Sudan's borders with Libya, with Chad, with Central African Republic, and also South Sudan. So that way, Al-Fashir is really, strategic and very important for them. But he also mentioned that some people are talking about maybe that this is going to be a step for a division in the country if they are actually able to occupy Al-Fashir. So if this happens and we see a division, then...
But isn't there a division already?
Between North and South Sudan?
Yes, there is already a division. There is already, and right now these divisions per se is not going to impact positively or negatively what has already happened on the ground. You see, there has been the fact that a democratic administration was not allowed to last.
Yeah.
Is because these are the same RSF and military that did not, the Sudanese Armed Forces and the Rapid Support Forces, who were working under Omar al-Bashir. And when they helped in ousting of the dictator or the then leader, authoritarian leader, and a transitional government was put in place, it didn't seem like they were okay taking orders from a transitional government. And then the government was ousted too.
Yeah.
And then we see a power struggle between the two. So while we're talking about areas and if there are going to be fissures within the society itself, I think that's a conversation that should have taken place yesterday.
Yeah.
Today, it is not about fissures anymore. It is about absolute intervention. And the international community has to look into it. They need to come in. If they're not going to face, although there are some sanctions.
Exactly.
But, but if they're not going to face stringent sanctions,
yes,
and consequences for what is happening, for the killings, then you will see more of Sudanese people die, and more of them rendered refugees. They're refugees in their own country. They're refugees abroad. Only in terms of statistics, if I can just pull this out.
Yeah.
Only in terms of statistics, look at the number of people according to UNHCR who have left Sudan. We have 350,000 people in Egypt. 600,000 in Chad. Chad has taken in the maximum number of people from Sudan.
Yeah.
25,000 in Central African Republic. 590,000 in South Sudan, only a little less than Chad, but there's a massive familial tie between Sudan and South Sudan, and connections and so on and so forth, and 192,000 in Ethiopia. So all the neighboring countries have taken in refugees. And it's interesting that it's in the same area, if you see, where they have been saying, and Egypt has said, we will not take refugees from Palestine, from Gaza. But they're taking refugees from here. Sudan, so a lot of people had criticized Egypt, saying that, for a country that is bordering and is speaking so much, why aren't you going to take refugees from Palestine? You do not want a refugee problem in your country. And this was Egypt's answer. They said, it's not like we don't take refugees. Look, we're taking refugees from various parts of the world. And now Sudan is also an example. They said we will not take refugees from Gaza is because if Egypt opens its borders, which again Israel has also not allowed, because the border is under their control, and they don't want to have the so-called Hamas, get safe havens in other parts of the world. So one that. Secondly, but if they're also their argument was, some of the people I was speaking to, is that if we allow them to come, then most of them will leave. If they can and should they be allowed to leave, they will leave. And then Gaza will be open for Israel to take.
Exactly.
So the same thing that happened in the past will repeat itself, and they will just have more land, and you will have more displaced Palestinians. So it's not like we're against refugees. We are just as a country that supports the cause of Palestine, not wanting to, only hoping that Israel will not kill civilians and will allow them to stay wherever they are so that they continue staying in Gaza. That was not to be. Israel, despite all the international pressure, has gone ahead and bombarded Rafah.
Yes, precisely.
So that's just for an example that a lot of refugees from Sudan have moved to Egypt.
But then there was also this dilemma that I read of about Egypt facing this dilemma in the current conflict in Sudan, as Egypt is close to Sudan's army, which is fighting against the RSF, which is believed to be backed by the UAE. And the UAE is a major financial supporter of Egypt. So how is Egypt then
it's a power struggle. There's a lot of things at stake. Sudan is resource rich, and so they all want their stakes in. It was very early on after Omar al-Bashir that they knew what side they wanted to take, and they'd already started. Egypt, being a neighboring country, wanted very clearly to have ties with the official army, but given that there was a power struggle that UAE saw, and it certainly is an opportunity, but no country can gain out of the misery of another country to this extent. So right now, the focus should be on how to douse the civil war, this huge fire that the civil war has caused.
It's not like I think you remember last episode also when we were discussing last year, and you said that this is not like a sectarian strife, right?
No, it is not.
So it's like a civil war. So how do we?
So people are not taking sides. They're stuck between the military and the RSF. Depending on which party has a stronger hold, they are at the mercy of those people. And last time also when we were discussing this, and we'd said that all the granaries and the grains had come under the control of these people, and they were not allowing food to reach to the common man because they themselves were storing it for their own forces and the soldiers, so on and so forth. And today the scenario is such that even they do not have enough food for themselves. So it's a very sad state of affairs, but nothing like what the people of Sudan right now are reeling under. So the military and the RSF, they have been warring after Omar al-Bashir was ousted in 2019 and a transitional government was put in place. And we know it came with the help of the military. But it is the RSF that had always had a lot of support coming in from Omar al-Bashir.
Okay.
And so Omar al-Bashir had then the then leader, RSF leader, Hemedti, who actually won a lot of favors from Omar al-Bashir. They had come about and made this militia group,
Okay.
Janjaweed. And
Yeah.
then so Omar al-Bashir wanted him to take on the military. And that certainly became that paramilitary force, which is the RSF. And which is why the fight between them is not just one of them trying to take control. It is also about this one faction trying to fight for the return of an authoritarian leader.
Yeah.
And in that, you will see that so Omar al-Bashir in this part of the world, as a massive Muslim leader, would have found some support from the Arab world.
Okay.
But it is the military faction where the ousting of the dictatorship happened, and we were looking at a part of the Arab Spring much late in the day,
Yeah.
but a part of the Arab Spring where you have had authoritarian leaders really been taken down, and then the transitional government comes in. The military camp is not accepting of it, but is supported by outside forces too, who maybe do not want the RSF and the return of the old order. So that certainly also is at play.
Yeah.
But there is no certain sectarian faction as such that is fighting one against the other. What we are looking at are two factions fighting for power.
Yeah.
And in that, it's the people of Sudan who've become a victim of this entire war.
Okay. So how do we get, like practically speaking, how do we get a resolution? As in, if both sides are vying for control and they want the position of commander-in-chief because they want the proposed integration of the RSF into the military. During the integration process, the position of commander-in-chief will be by whom? Like, how do we, practically speaking, how will that be ascertained?
See, right now, there is no resolution in sight. Even if there is going to be this, the two men are not going to work under each other. There has to be a negotiation where we say, and also the fact that RSF has gained a lot of ground in the country. So it's always the losing faction that will have to compromise a little. But what that compromise is going to be, something we'll have to wait and see, because I don't know whether if the world is ready to have RSF take control and then have, the leadership of the country change again from a democratic structure that they envisioned to an authoritarian structure. So it all depends also on the negotiations that will take place, because I don't think a country once that has seen a revolution such as this, that has seen a change such as this, and thought that they'll finally, have a democratic regime, a democratic government, would want to return to anything less than that.
Of course.
And too much has been lost. Too many lives have been lost. Too many homes have been burned down. A lot of your land, your cattle, your property stands completely destroyed.
Yeah.
So for what?
Yeah. And villages are burnt and being burnt like anything. The reporter from the
People
NPR,
have not been able to go back to their farmland. Is the reason why there is famine.
Yeah.
So it's not because there was some massive heat wave or drought.
It's not. It's
It is
natural.
because people could not go and till their land and water their lands. So all of that led to a place where there was no food that was grown.
Yeah.
All their farmland is lying in the ruins.
Yeah. But you mentioned about sanctions and everything. But, how did we arrive at this, if we go and try to answer this, in the sense that I'm not going beyond 2023 at this point. I'm just saying that after 2023, we also spoke, when the civil war broke out last year, the international community must have anticipated that, such a country which is so much prone, definitely such a scenario can happen. So then, and also, of course, about hunger, starvation. Then why were no efforts made from the international community's end when this war broke out last year? If we actually try to track as to what the international and how the international community has responded, how certain countries like the US, which has like a very vested interest in the region, or a country like Saudi Arabia. I remember reading about it that when both these countries, as soon as the war broke out, I think in April or May, both these countries, US and Saudi, they tried to negotiate a 72-hour truce, but then it was quickly violated. Then both US and Saudi, they also initiated talks between the army and the RSF. Both sides, at that point, they agreed to allow, urgently needed humanitarian aid. But once again, the fighting just never stopped. So these ceasefire agreements, they were kept on, being violated again and again. Then what happened? Then the US came in. It imposed the first sanctions related to the conflict. And how it did, it targeted two firms which are associated with the army and two others which are linked to the RSF. And it warned that it would hold accountable to all those undermining the peace in the country. Similarly, the UK also sanctioned three businesses linked with the army and three with the RSF. But nothing, of course, it still lingers on. Nothing seemed to deter them. No truce, no resolution. UN said international donors pledged nearly $1.5 billion for the humanitarian response to Sudan, but the body is saying that its emergency aid program requires $2.57 billion at least. So, do you think, in whatever sense and capacity the international community has responded right as soon as this civil war broke through has not been adequate, has not been enough?
Well, it absolutely has not been enough. There have been certain channels that opened up some time ago after the war started, and the Saudi Arabia did come in. There was the Treaty of Jeddah, where RSF and SAF had met to negotiate terms and conditions. And while there were the various rounds of talks, they all ended in failure. But the only thing that they really focused on and maybe agreed upon was to open channels for humanitarian aid.
Yeah.
That's the area where both sides agreed. And while the negotiations were indefinitely suspended last year itself, because both sides failed to open those aid channels, we've not seen the international community really intervene on the restarting of negotiations between the two sides itself, where you would have at least 8 channels going, although we know that a lot of international organizations are working on the ground. But it comes back to what the international community, Anna, has really done. And there I see a real lack of, although at the United Nations, at various levels, there have been resolutions, there have been conversations, there have been urgent meetings that have been called on Sudan, but none that really has affected bringing about peace.
Just quickly, Geeta, when you mentioned we'll have to see what negotiations will be taking place, but then who will...
There are countries in the neighborhood that have played in the Jeddah conversations was one of them. So we'll have to see.
But then if we talk about some country like Egypt, who is closer to the army, then of course, who will listen to Egypt then?
Which is why Saudi Arabia most probably will have to come in, because they do wield influence in the region, and it is an Islamic nation. So in all probability, they will look to Saudi to intervene. And yes, they will carry a lot of weight and voice from the West too, in terms of what needs to be done. But right now, it doesn't seem like there is... right now, what the international community or what the agencies are focused on is to ensure that at least aid starts getting in and the violence stops. So there have been numerous occasions and call for ceasefire and announcements of ceasefire, but none of them have been honored. So unless and until both sides actually honor a ceasefire call, because if there's a complete cessation of violence, then you can start rebuilding and giving people, some sort of aid. It's very difficult to reach them in places where violence is continuing.
True.
And despite the numerous calls, both sides have not honored.
Yeah, and amidst all this, it's just blame game that is happening, right? I mean, the Sudan's foreign ministry, they are saying that, okay, we are trying our every means to get the humanitarian aid reach the steps. But the RSF, but they are saying that the RSF are looting, but then the RSF is denying. So it's just blame game. I don't know how long will that continue. Also, on the fact that since we're speaking of famine, a global authority on food insecurity, the Famine Early Warning Systems Network, they have said that they are, of course, at the risk of famine. And if we speak about logistics, an aid truck that can, I mean, if it has to reach Darfur, it can take up to 40 days to reach Darfur from Port Sudan in the east, where most of the aid is stored. So, like in Gaza and Ukraine, also, we have spoken about it, that we see a global voice. Last episode only, we were speaking about, US students voicing their concerns, but not demeaning that. But I'm just saying here, when we see a lot of so little being spoken from the international community, from from globally as well, there are rarely any voices, out there in its support. So what really happens if they are now at the risk of famine? So what really happens when famine actually engulfs the country? When there is no respite? Because, like I mentioned, the humanitarian assistance, it has reached only 16% of the people who need it. And also, if you go and, like I was watching certain video dispatches, they're standing in a queue and they're just waiting for their turns, and their turns is, I mean, they're not ever coming up. Even if they're getting something that's like really, really sparse.
Also does
So,
not feed the entire family.
not, yeah, of course. So, what really happens if actually famine, engulfs the country and
It
there's no
already
respite?
has. They're on the brink of starvation, Anna. It already has. If the world does not wake up to this, then there's a real problem. And in terms of diplomatic efforts, whilst I was saying that a lot of things have happened at the United Nations, we did have Al Burhan, who managed to leave Khartoum. He not only went and met Al Sisi in Egypt, he actually went to the United Nations to attend the UNGA assembly session. And then he had asked the United Nations to declare RSF a terrorist organization. But because of the pulls and pushes, we'll have to wait and see how that really works out. But some sort of a stringent step on and aside has to be taken on where do you want to see Sudan? Do you want to see Sudan? In fact, even the military takeover was wrong. So, who's promising a transitional government? Who's promising the return of a democratic setup? We've not heard those conversations right now. The only hope is to see Saudi Arabia, Egypt come in, because Egypt does hold influence over Al Burhan. And Saudi Arabia certainly will hold influence over the other faction that also has, UAE also has a lot of support, or they are engaged and connected in many ways than one. So we will have to wait and see how these countries then come together to say, well, no matter what you want, no matter what your end game is in terms of a government, what form of government, for now, what is absolutely required is cessation of violence. And it is sad that we are talking about it today, Anna. We spoke about it earlier too, but it is really sad that this has actually found no space in general news.
I mean,
whereas this is one of the biggest crises. You can focus on Russia, Ukraine, you can focus on Israel, Hamas, and Gaza is a very, very big story to cover. But nothing takes away from the fact that an African nation is reeling under the worst crisis, and most people don't even know about it.
I mean, that's like, it's a very sad reality. But just, thank God that on this podcast we have covered at least, places like Niger, places like Sudan in our podcast, and we try to, of course, cover something that, that don't make as trends on social media, but we do make sure that we cover it on our podcast. Just lastly, as we leave, there's something that I really want to talk about the US's role here, because it's, although I mean, there's a backgrounder to this. We just suddenly didn't come to 2023 and just woke up to a civil war, right? It is there in the history, lingering in the history. So let's just talk about that briefly, Geeta. Because, US's role is so crucial. It just loves, sanctioning, to put sanctions on African nations. But its role in the crisis in Sudan has more history to it. Sudan has often been called the arms dump of Africa. During the Cold War, it was one of many, proxy battlefields for the US and the Soviet Union, who would wage war via local proxies. And the US also reportedly sold arms worth over $1 billion to Sudan during this time. Now, both these powers, saw the makings of an ethnic power struggle, the seeds of which had been sown by the British in Sudan earlier. Now, they almost reduced the seriousness of the tensions in the country to their, narrow battle of this capitalism versus communism. And after the end of the Cold War, the breakup of the Soviet Union with the US, now seeing itself as the, upholder of good virtue in the world, sanctions were placed in Sudan, with the US labeling it as a state sponsor of terrorism. So Sudan was eventually, what happened, it was eventually cut off from the international trade and deprived of even essential items. Now it has escalated to this level. But could you actually, say that 20 years of economic sanctions would have played a really crucial, important role in the civil wars that have plagued the country and even the secession of South Sudan that we have seen? So, and we have seen what US has done in Afghanistan as well. Can we say that the US and major powers very conveniently escape accountability for how they have, so-called exploited a very resource-rich country for their own gains? Remember, we spoke about, when we were speaking about
No, it's a very
Niger.
important point you make. But again, we have to put it in context. And the context is this, Anna, that when the games were being played with Sudan, again, the focus and the idea of engaging Sudan was because it is resource rich. There are gold mines, which again were offered by Omar al-Bashir to his man, which is the Galo, and Hamedti. But that was then. It was Omar al-Bashir. And the sanctioning, the whole idea of arm twisting was happening with an authoritarian regime. Things changed in 2023. And since then, US is trying to be careful, because either way, they don't know which way this war is going to go. Okay. And either way, they will have to engage Sudan and ensure that they have a foothold in this African region. Country, which is a very important state, not just resource rich. You have the China factor, the Russia factor in Africa now.
Of course.
Even the African Union has done very little when they have tried very hard, and there are conversations in the African Union that are taking place on Sudan almost on a daily basis. But beyond that, there isn't an intervention that we see apart from involvement of the neighboring countries in taking in refugees. So what did the US do after 2023? They have sanctioned yet again. This time around, they've sanctioned the military commander of RSF, which is Hamedti's younger brother, not the commander, the deputy commander. But at the same time, they went ahead and sanctioned 3 of the officers from the military faction as well. So they're sanctioning who they think are responsible for the civil war, and they want the war to end. But in the long run, they're also, by doing this, by not taking sides, and by doing this and not looking at a serious intervention, they have intervened. They've sent weapons to Israel, right? Because it's a strategic partner. It impacts them directly, anything that happens to them. Over here, they want the resources. They want to be a part of the African story. But when it comes to a crisis such as this, it's not just the United States of America, the whole of West, including countries, big economies, who have really not come forward to do anything for Sudan. So it's a very sad story right now, where none of them really want to get their hands dirty, because nobody, I think, has the capability or the economic might and power right now to take on such a huge responsibility after they're already completely submerged with what is happening in the other two conflicts. That could be the reason why, but it doesn't take away from the fact that countries talk about democracy, values of humanity, and the one place apart from Gaza, of course, and yes, in the Russia-Ukraine war, Ukraine, the travesty of justice that we're seeing over here, the fact that there's so many children dying of hunger and nobody's looking into that is certainly a shame. Not just for the international community, but for each one of us who might be stakeholders, might not be, but have not cared to find out.
And there's no better way to put it, actually, Geeta, but because, like you said in the very beginning, until and unless it doesn't hit home, we are least bothered.
Yeah.
So on that note, I think we'll put an end to this conversation. And to all our listeners and viewers who stayed till the end, we have actually discussed Sudan in much detail in our previous episode that we did last year in April.
Yes.
So
the civil war.
The civil war, when it just broke out. So to everybody's convenience, I'll put that description in the show notes so you can refer to it. Besides, we have also done some really fabulous episodes on different parts of the world. Niger, I think that's one of my favorite episodes. So you can revisit that and let us know what you felt about this episode or any of the other, episodes that you have listened to in recent times. So let us know. The number is 8588966996 and the email ID is pods@indiatoday.com. Do reach out and we'll be really, really thankful and happy to include all your inputs on our show.
Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you.